Hi guys, this is the last video, Ansible variables and templates. In the last video, we looked at Ansible configuration. In this video, we're going to take a look at Ansible variables and Ansible template. We will also see flow control and roles. Variables and templates are an important part of Ansible. They allow us to override values in our configuration so that we can write generic playbooks that can be reused across different configurations with minor tweaks. With templates, we can render configuration files from our host, so we would potentially use Ansible to manage the configuration of remote servers with little to no effort. It can also be used to generate and install SSL certificates for different hosts transparently to the user. Variables and templates use a template engine called Jinja 2, which allows logic and interpolation to be embedded in our configurations. In general, there are several ways of defining variables. If you want to explore further different ways of defining variables, the official documentation provides a fairly comprehensive guide at this website. Let us see Ansible variables. Variables are the most simple of the potential customizations. With variables, we can define values that are going to be replaced in our playbooks. Let's take a look at the playbook. We now replace the content of tasks.yml. There are two new symbols in our task. Also, our task is new. Debug is used to output values from our variables into the terminal while executing the playbook. Let's take a look at the execution. As you can see, it fails. The reason for the failure can be seen in the message. We have a variable defined called name that doesn't have a value associated. Ansible will fail if there is a value that cannot be interpolated, aborting the execution of the task. There's another interesting piece of information here. Ansible gives you a parameter to retry the playbook only on the hosts that were not successful. If we wanted to retry the playbook only on the failed hosts, we could run the next command. The new parameter, tasks.retry, is a file with a list of hosts that are okay to rerun the playlist as they have failed before. Going back to our missing variables, we need to define the variable called myname. There are a few ways of doing that. The first is via the command line. And you can see that the output of the playbook is looking better now. As you can see, the variables get interpolated and we can see the message, "Hello David." The second way of defining variables is via inventory. If we modify our inventory, the value of our variable will be David inventory, and we don't need to pass a value in the command line. This will produce the message, "Hello David inventory." The third way to define variables in Ansible is by defining them in the playbook itself. Let's take a look at the playbook. As simple as it sounds, once you define the variable in the vars section of your playbook, it becomes available. Therefore, there is no need to specify the value anywhere else. The fourth way to define variables is via files. Ansible is designed to be a self-documented component that can be easily understood by someone with not much experience in it. One of the ways in which Ansible facilitates the task of understanding playbooks is the possibility of writing every single configuration piece in a file. Variables are not the exception, so Ansible will let you define variables in files or playbooks. Let's start with the files. We will create a file called vars.yml in the same folder in which you are working with this content. Now, we should run this command in order to use the variables file. Oops, we have to specify the name of the playbook. And if you check the output, it will be the same as the one from earlier. In this case, we've defined a new variable that we are not using, but that's fine. I wanted to show you that Ansible won't complain if there are free variables, but it will raise an error if there are inbound interpolations. In this case, we've included vars.yml in our playbook via the command line, referencing your local file with @ in the beginning. But there is another possibility for using variable files in Ansible, including them from within the playbook. Let's take a look at how it is done. In this case, we've used the include_vars module in our playbook. Now, we execute the playbook with the -i inventory command. As you can see, there is an extra task that takes a file and injects the variables in the context. This module is quite flexible, and there are several options to include variable files in our playbook. We have used the most straightforward one, but you can check out other options in the official documentation at this website. There is another possibility for including a variable file into our playbook, and it is using the vars_files directive in our playbook. This will take the vars.yml file and inject all the defined variables into the context, making them available for use. As you can see, Ansible is quite flexible around the definition of variables. There is another interesting way of setting up variables in Ansible that helps us further customize our playbooks: set_fact. Setting the facts allows us to set variables dynamically in our playbooks. Set_fact can be used in combination with another interesting instruction called register. Let's look at an example. The complete list of variable precedents can be found at this link. Now we will see Ansible templates. Templates are another powerful tool from Ansible. They allow us to render configuration files, application properties, and anything that can be stored in a human-readable file. Templates rely heavily on variables and a template engine called Jinja 2, which is used by Ansible to render the templates. First, we're going to install Nginx on our server with a simple playbook. As you can see, it is very simple. Update the apt cache, upgrade the system, and install Nginx. Now, we just run the playbook using the VM created earlier. And when the playbook is finished, you should have Nginx running in your remote server. In order to verify, we just open the browser and use the IP of our VM as URL. You should see the Nginx welcome screen. Now, we're going to create a template with the Nginx configuration, where we can add or remove servers with templates in a fairly easy manner. Next, we create a folder called Nginx servers in the current directory and add a file called nginx.yml with this content. Let's explain the file a bit. The system is upgraded using apt. Using apt as well, Nginx is installed. Note that Ansible uses a declarative approach to install packages. You state the name of the package and the state that the package should be in after the playbook is executed. The playbook renders the configuration for a virtual server in Nginx from this template. We'll come back to this in a second. The playbook reloads the Nginx service so that the new configuration takes effect. We have a few blocks missing in the preceding playbook. The first block is the file called nginx-1.conf.j2. This file is a template that is used to render the Nginx configuration for a virtual host in the server. Let's look at the content of that file. Now, we create a file called sites enabled. Next, add the nginx-1.conf.j2 file to it with this content. This file is a standard Nginx server block, but with one particularity. We have a server 1 port as a placeholder for the port, so that we can control the port where the Nginx virtual host is exposed. This is very familiar to us. We are using the variables to render the templates. The second block is the file called vars.yml, and we add this content to it. This is very simple. It just defines the variables required to render the template from earlier. One thing that you need to be aware when using templates is that all the variables in the context can be accessed in it, from the facts gathered from the remote server to the variables defined everywhere. Once we have everything in place, we can run the playbook as usual and verify that everything works as expected. If everything worked as expected, you should have a fully functional Nginx server in your VM in Google Cloud Platform on the port 3000. Google Cloud Platform has a deny by default policy in order to enhance security, so you might need to adjust the firewall to allow inbound traffic to certain ports. Now, let's move to flow control. In Ansible, it is possible to use flow control statements such as loops or conditionals using variables as input. This can be used to repeat tasks on a certain dataset and avoid executing some tasks if a few conditions are not met. We have already seen an example of conditionals, but let's explain it a bit more. The code is very easy to read. A command is executed and it registers a variable called result. Then we have two debug tasks. The first one will only be executed only if the /bin/false command fails. The second one will be executed only if the /bin/false command succeeds. In this playbook, we're using two new tricks. The first trick is ignore errors. With this clause, if the task fails, the playbook will continue executing the tasks. This is very helpful if we want to test for assumptions in the system. For example, if some files are present or a certain network interface is configured. The next trick is pipe symbol. It is a Jinja 2 expression used to filter values. In this case, we are using the failed and succeeded filters to return true or false, depending on the outcome of the command. There are many filters that can be used on Jinja 2 to work in a similar way as Unix pipes transforming the data that goes through them. Another type of control flow structure are loops. Let's look at how loops work. Here, we are using something new that we did not see at the time of explaining variables. They can have a structure such as lists and dictionaries. In this case, we are defining a list with a few names and outputting a message for each of them. Now, it's time to run the playbook. Let's save the content in a file called loops.yml and execute the Ansible-i inventory command. We will assume that the inventory is the same as the one used in the last examples. After finishing, we should see this output. It is also possible to define a list using the compact version of the declaration. Now, we look at this statement. It can be redefined like this. And it is totally equivalent. It is also possible to define dictionaries in Ansible and use them as variables. They can also be used as iterable elements, which enable us to give structure to our data. If you're familiar with software development, it will make perfect sense to you. A list of structured data that holds information to be accessed by the key. If you want to learn more about it, these are the links used for conditionals, loops, and Jinja 2 templating. Now, let's move to roles. We've been working on a few Ansible playbooks, and as you can imagine, there's a lot that can be abstracted from them into generic units of work. With our current knowledge of Ansible, the best thing we can do is use a naming convention for playbooks and files so that we don't mix them. But Ansible provides a better approach to this: roles. Think of roles as common reusable capabilities as you do with modules in software, which is a highly cohesive set of playbooks, variables, and resources that work together for one purpose. For example, if we're managing Nginx, it makes sense to have all the related resources in a single module in order to improve the reusability as well as clarity of the code. One option would be including playbooks using Ansible features. Let's explain what is going on. We can see two files included. The first include is what Ansible calls a play include. It is a fully functional playbook as is, which gets included in another playbook. The second include is what Ansible calls a task include. It only includes a list of tasks. This can be explained easily by looking at the content of the two files. First, look at the content of playinclude.yml. Second, we look at the content of tasksinclude.yml. Now, we're going to execute the playbooks from earlier and see what the output is. Now, save the content of the first playbook on a file called tasks.yml and use the same inventory as on all the examples. Now, run this command. Once the execution is finished, let's examine the output. The play include gets executed by outputting the debug message in there. The debug task in the main playbook gets executed. The task includes gets executed by executing the two debug messages included here. It's not very complicated, but it gets easier if you play around a bit with the playbooks. Roles are isolated sets of functionalities that allow an easy maintenance cycle like any other software component. We can rewrite it using 3 roles: the play include, the main tasks, and the tasks include. In order to start creating roles, first we will create a new folder called Ansible Roles and a folder called Roles inside the same one. It is a good practice to create a set of folders to hold Ansible resources, task folders to hold the tasks, files folders to store all the files that need to be transferred to the remote hosts, and so on. In general, I agree with this setup, but for the examples, we just simplified it in order to make everything easier. For roles, this setup is mandatory. We need to create the folders as appropriated. In this case, as we're only going to use tasks to demonstrate how roles work, we will create the folder tasks inside of every role because otherwise we won't execute the tasks from the role. Inside the roles folder, we're going to create another folder called play include, which is going to be the equivalent to playinclude.yml. Now, it is time to create our first role playbook, so we can create a file called main.yml and place it inside the play include tasks folder. This is the content of the main.yml file. Now, it is time to add a second role called main tasks by creating a folder in roles and adding a file called main.yml inside of roles/main-tasks/tasks file. And our third and last role is called tasks include. We just create the folder and add a file called main.yml to it inside of the tasks folder. And that's it. We've created 3 roles that can be reused across different Ansible projects. Now it is time to use them. Now we create a file called tasks.yml in the root folder of our project and add this content to it. This is how our project should look after adding all the files. The inventory is the same. Now it is time to run our playbook. It will produce the output. If we compare the output from the last example, we can see that it is virtually the same, except for the legend of the tasks, which indicates the role that the task is coming from. In roles, we can also define variables and access to the variables defined in the global scope, as well as many other features. If I can give you some advice regarding Ansible, it would be that you should always try to use roles. It doesn't matter how big or simple your project is. You'll find out very soon that the isolation and reusability that roles provide at pretty much no cost are quite beneficial. In this video, we have looked at Ansible variables and templates. That's all for this video. Let's have a quick recap. This section started with server provision software. We then moved to Ansible configuration. After that, we saw Ansible variables and templates. Amazing! That brings us to the end of this course. I hope you guys had fun learning DevOps fundamentals. All the best!